Thin wind tonight. Trees whisper. A child's mask in the gutter breathes when the wind moves it. No screams, only stillness. 3 quiet stories, 1 lamp, lights down. Before we start, do our 3 soft checks with me. Slow breath in, loosen your jaw, thumb on the table. Click the quiet key. Drop your city and local time in the comments and add what you're listening on, so our little night map can circle the world. New, calm history. Horror arrives most nights. If this keeps you company, wait until the video ends to subscribe, then tap the bell so the next file finds you. After, tell me what details stayed with you. The cul-de-sac had learned to keep its own hours. Neighbours closed their curtains early as if tucking the street in. Porches grew polite and distant, their lights dimmed to polite pools rather than brazen invitations. Lawns became measured rectangles of darkness where stray toys and plastic chairs acquired the dignified look of relics. It was a neighbourhood that had decided by small and unanimous gestures to make silence its way of living together. At the far end stood the narrow clapboard house, its white paint gone the colour of old paper. The gates sagged as if sympathising with hinges the town had stopped oiling. For a long time people told a tidy story about that house, a tragedy, one autumn night, and then a deliberate forgetting, a tacit agreement that some things are better left outside conversation. The porch light was a kind of barometer for that forgetting. It had been dark for years. The neighbours said it was out of respect, then used the phrase out of respect until it softened into an excuse. Later, out of respect simply meant they did not know what to say when the house made a sound. Mr. Halloway kept his house neat in the ways of people who talk to objects. He swept the stoop, kept short rows of basil in battered pots, and mended socks with the same concentrated care he used on his own hands. He had a way of answering the door as if practice had taught his muscles before his mind. That night, a chill early in October, the kind of night that smells of wood smoke and a small, thin rain, his hand moved toward the knob. There was a small figure under the eaves, no older than the idea of older, wrapped in a coat that had seen better decades. The child's mask, a fox rendered in felt, was pushed back on the head, making the face look like a thing that had been politely told to wait. The paper bag the child held sagged at the top. The corners were softened by use, as if it had been carried many times for things not always meant to travel. When the door opened, the child tilted the bag and a single penny rolled, slow and deliberate, like a sentence being set down. "You promised," he said. The sound had the unhurried flatness of someone reading a line they had rehearsed into being. The syllables did not ask. They reminded, as unruffled as a calendar. Mr. Halloway felt, at once, 2 things that do not often share a throat: the small and polite fear that someone feels when the doorbell rings late, and the wide, old ache of a memory that has the temperature of old coins. He saw the shape of the child's hands, the way they clenched the bag as if measuring the weight of the moment. The voice was not new to him. It fit into the hollow behind his teeth like a found object. For a long time he had used tidy phrases with people who asked, "It was an accident. It was years ago. We put it away." Those phrases were practical tools designed to keep the town's catalogue neat. But there are certain small things that do not sit contentedly in the drawer marked acceptable conversation. Promises are among them. They are paper-thin, yes, but they also have the stubborn heft of coins. He remembered the promise then, as if the word had a hinge. It was the kind of promise people make with the soft, unremarkable intention of returning. "I'll be right back." He could smell now the kitchen light he had been under, the summer-heated bulb that made the teacup look thirsty. And he could remember a small boy with a scraped knee who needed one more lap around the yard. Memory unfurled in tidy domestic scenes, a car light, the noise of tires on wet gravel, the sense that the world would keep to its pattern long enough for him to come back. The child watched him, unblinking. The fox mask made small shadows across his chin. It was the look of someone who had kept a practice of waiting. Mr. Halloway felt the old temptation to say a sentence that would tidy the moment. "I'm sorry," or "It's not like that." The words lodged, as words will, in the place where explanation has sometimes been kept for simpler days. "What did you promise?" a polite voice might have asked across a neighbour's fence. But here the voice inside his head was only the accumulated hush of the cul-de-sac, people who had decided silence would be a communal virtue. When the world agrees to be quiet, memory often finds itself louder for the absence. He crouched by degrees, the motion like returning a borrowed book to a shelf. Up close he could see the felt was worn at the edge where fingers had probably rubbed it raw. Under the sleeve of the child's coat, a small wrist bone showed absurdly thin. The weather had pressed the edges of the paper bag into soft stars, and the penny lay still at the step, reflecting a small, dull light. Mr. Halloway extended his hand without quite deciding whether to take or to give. The child placed a palm on the old man's hand like a fact. "You promised," the child repeated. This time, the words were softer, threaded with the small conviction of something that had been rehearsed nightly like a lullaby. "You promised you would come back and look." For a long time after the accident, the town had become a set of small evasions. They patched language together the way people patch sweaters, with quick, tidy stitches that kept the garment serviceable. The neighbours started telling their children that some roads had dangerous potholes, and some nights it was better to be inside. They taught the children to cross at particular corners. They learned small rituals: knock only when you must, do not linger at the bend of Mill Street, do not ask the widower in the White House anything too personal. But rituals, even when carefully laid, have the curious property of shifting the burden of proof. If you do not speak the truth, sometimes the truth will speak anyway. Over the following days, the porch light remained on for the first time in years. Mr. Halloway moved the lamp to the window so the glow would spill across the stoop like a small domestic harbour. He put the penny in his pocket, then in a small ceramic bowl on the table by the door. He smoothed the felt with the tenderness of someone touching an object that once belonged to a child. People noticed that he was up earlier and later than before, moving across his yard with a care that looked like prayer. The town began to keep small records without meaning to. A neighbour counted the days the lamplight stayed lit and wrote them on the back of a receipt to give to his wife, as if such things could be catalogued. A high schooler took a photo of the porch from across the hedge and uploaded it to an online forum where people argued about small-town ghosts and perfect pumpkin placements. Someone left a note on the town bulletin board. Did anyone leave a fox mask on Halloway's step? It was the way the town tried to convert attention into a manageable thing, but attention has its own weather. Once you look closely enough, the things you think you have put away become visible at the edge of the light. Old grievances, small overlooked kindnesses, the math of minutes that can never be squared away. A promise, once remembered, is like a rented object that wishes to be returned. A week after the first knock, a young woman from down the street, June, who worked evenings at the library, knocked on Mr. Halloway's door. She had the kind of practical face that belongs to people who file things. She carries receipts, she writes lists in the margins of books, and she believes in the economy of small tasks. She had been the sort of person who, when she saw the porch light, walked the long way home until someone else answered their own door or the light blinked out. That night she felt a gravity she could not explain. She had been at the reference desk all day, and books incline the mind to curiosity. When Mr. Halloway opened, June's hands folded around a paper cup of coffee as if it were a document she could offer. Her eyes flicked to the bowl where pennies collected. Then she saw the felt. She did not ask for permission to sit. She lowered herself on the bench by the door, and for a little time they simply looked at each other, two people who had the patience to sit in the quiet and see what might come. "Did you promise him something?" she asked, not in the direct way of accusation, but with the gentle inquiry one uses when asking about a delicate illness. "Or did you promise you would come back and look?" Her voice was low, the kind of question librarians ask when a book's margins are crowded with notes. Mr. Halloway looked down at the penny bowl as if the coins could answer. "I told him I would bring him a new shoelace," he said after a time, and the sentence sounded both ridiculous and unbearable. "He wanted one like the old one, green with a stripe. I told him I'd be right back." June nodded, as if the detail itself, green with a stripe, made a map she could follow. She reached and smoothed the felt with her finger, the way someone handling the corner of an old photograph might. In that motion, there was the exchange that performs the human economy of grief. Small touch, small permission to remember. Outside, a neighbour's dog barked twice and then fell quiet. The cul-de-sac seemed to draw breath and hold it. The light off the lamp pressed in a circle on the porch, framing the two of them like a small stage. Between a man who had practiced the muscle of answering a door and a woman who catalogued the public life of books, the promise hung like an item left on the counter until someone chooses to take it. The host's voice, if one were to narrate the scene for a listener in the soft, careful tone the channel favours, would drift closer here, not to explain but to ask. Have you ever found yourself holding a promise like an object because you didn't know where else to put it? The question is quiet. It functions like a mirror rather than a finger. It asks the listener to feel whether they too have kept something in a pocket for too long. June looked up then, as if hearing the question somewhere between them. "Whatever it was," she said, "it's still here." It was not comfort, exactly. It was the reporting of a fact. Mr. Halloway folded his hands around the bowl. He did not try to tidy the memory into a single sentence. Instead, he allowed the outline of the past to remain. A house with a lamp off, a child with a fox mask, a promise that had the texture of ordinary speech. The human encounter, small, practical, honest, acted like a hinge opening. It let air move where stale patterns had been stored. Promises, after all, do not only return in sudden supernatural ways, they return in the quiet economy of neighbourliness, in the small acts that re-anchor people to one another. A cup of coffee, a careful question, the willingness to touch a felt mask and say the name it had carried. The town would continue to shift, as towns do. Rituals would be tested, curtains would twitch. But for the moment, on that porch, the work of remembering had a shape and a hand to hold it. Once the porch light was turned on, the neighbourhood found a new kind of clock. It did not measure hours so much as returns. Small, patterned arrivals that folded themselves around the lamp's circle and then melted back into the hedges. A rhythm established itself. Evenings when the pennies came, mornings when someone would find a scrap of felt on a stoop, and the occasional sound of a child humming that no one could locate. People began to notice details they had not looked for before. The pennies were always on the left side of the step, a tiny insistence someone chalked up to habit or an unconscious preference. The felt, a scrap of fox ear, a corner of stitched felt that smelled faintly of glue and the kind of smoke that lingers after a small, controlled kitchen fire. was warm as if it had been pressed against a cheek minutes before. The warmth was impossible. Felt does not retain the body's heat for long in an autumn chill. Yet it did, again and again. At first, the town treated these occurrences like little weather systems you remark upon in small talk. Did you see the penny? Yes, left side, like always. The phrases ease a communal discomfort, working like a shared shiver that makes everyone feel less alone. But as the days lengthened into a second week, the pattern began to take on a shape that made people adjust their steps. Parents started calling their children earlier. Delivery drivers started to avoid Mr. Halloway's gate. A librarian made a note in the reference log. Possible recurring phenomenon. Advise cautious approach. Amir, a high school sophomore who worked the evening shift at the corner deli, became a kind of accidental chronicler. He had the habit of standing on the stoop before his shift, cigarette-free these days, his breath a pale marker in the chill air. Amir liked patterns. That is why he kept lists on the back of his invoice pads. He started to record the nights the pennies surfaced and the times people saw the felt. It amused him first. It interested him later. By the end of the month, his pad held a tidy ledger, dates in one column, weather in another, a short note, felt warm, or penny on left, in a third. On a Wednesday, just after dusk, Amir found a scrap of felt tucked into the crook of a lamppost near the deli. It had been folded carefully, as if left by someone who wanted it to be found without being obvious. He carried it into the store and set it under the hum of the open cooler, the fluorescent light making the fibre look like tiny, deliberate threads. An old woman who bought milk every night at the same time peered at it and sighed. "My mother always made fox masks for Halloween," she said. "She fixed them with glue like that." She did not elaborate. People from that generation kept the point of sadness tucked behind small domestic facts. Amir nodded and dutifully appended the line to his pad. "Found felt. Customer says maternal sewing." When the story crossed the street into the church basement, Pastor Lewis adjusted his collar as if the unease required an ecclesiastical response. He began his morning prayer with the same request, a small plea that if anything haunted the cul-de-sac, it would do so quietly. The pastor was the kind of man who believed in steady motions, greeting people on Sundays, organizing food drives, keeping the coffee warm in the fellowship hall. He admitted once, over a mug of off-brand tea at the deli counter, that he had caught himself checking his own mailbox at odd hours, as if a small ritual might make the world printable again. People told different versions of the penny story in ways that fit their profession. The hardware man said the pennies were clean, like someone had polished them. The school teacher said they sometimes found a single coin in her students' backpacks, where a child had slipped it for safekeeping. Children told the tale with the kind of casual horror that makes things more believable. "He said, 'You promised,'" one whispered to another, at the bus stop, and the bus seemed to roar a little more in response. With repetition came accretion, layers of small evidence that together suggested a kind of agency. A neighbour's doorbell camera, a model not many could afford, filmed a small, blurry silhouette at 2 in the morning. The footage, when posted to the town's private group, made the rounds not as proof, but as a prompt. "There," someone said, pointing at the screen in a comment, "you can see the hand." Another person replied with skepticism and a gif. The footage was never conclusive. The silhouette could have been a raccoon or a trick of light. But once you have a frame, your mind fills in the missing film. Sometimes the repetition was tender. Sometimes it was cruel. An older couple who had lost a child decades earlier took the news as if it were a summons. They placed a little ceramic bowl on their own stoop and filled it with pennies. The bowl was not left for collection, it was more like an offering. At night, they would sit in their kitchen and listen for the small footfalls, and some evenings they said they heard nothing but the usual breath of neighborhood life. Other evenings they swore the pennies had shifted as if someone had come and taken a single coin and set it in the neighbor's bowl down the street. The bowls multiplied like small altars. June, who had sat with Mr. Halloway on the bench, started a different kind of vigilance. She began walking the street at dusk with a thermos of tea and a camera she kept for errands. She found small things that made her chest tighten: a scrap of felt in the gutter, a child's shoelace knotted and left on a lamppost, a plastic dinosaur laid on the front step of a house that had no children. She would take photographs and catalogue them on her phone, not because she needed proof, but because collecting everything felt like being useful. The act of collecting is, after all, a way of holding a chaotic thing steady. One evening, a woman in her late 20s, named Rosa, a single mother with 2 small boys who rode bikes and left their helmets in a heap by the curb, knocked on Mr. Halloway's door. She had not come because she believed in ghosts. She had come because her youngest had found a penny stamped with the year he was born and insisted on giving it to the man whose porch lamp had become famous. Rosa had seen the way the light made the house less strange when she drove by. It made her calm in a way that had nothing to do with explanations. She stood on the step, holding the boy's small hand. Her eyes slid to the bowl and to the felt on the bench. There are moments in which ordinary people perform a kind of ritual out of instinct, a child offering a coin, a grown-up offering an explanationless touch. She extended the boy's hand so he could press the penny into the ceramic. The boy did so without ceremony, and when he looked up at Mr. Halloway, he asked the question children ask when they are given a small mystery. Where did the penny come from? The question is simple, and it demands a simple answer. Mr. Halloway looked at the child and then at Rosa. He could have recited the arc of denial the neighborhood had kept, but instead found himself telling a fragment of the truth as if it had a right to be spoken aloud. Sometimes promises come back in small things, he said. Sometimes they slide like coins under the door. Rosa bent and smoothed the felt with the tip of her finger. Do people come back when you leave a light? She asked, not in the skeptical way of an adult, but in the practical curiosity of someone who must plan bedtimes and dinner. Her question was human and exact. It required no metaphysics. June, sitting not far away, overheard and felt the scene fit into the pocket of the street, the way a hand fits into a glove. She took a photograph, not for evidence, but for the slow work of keeping a man, a child, a coin on a step, bathed in lamplight. She slid the picture into the same album she kept on her phone called Odd Nights. She would show it sometimes to friends, as if the act of showing made the world less lonely. The repetition began to ask for people. A pattern, if long enough, moves from being an oddity to an expectation. With expectancy comes obligation. People started to do things to meet the pattern. A woman left out spoons for an unknown presence. A teenager started dropping pieces of candy on the step. The town discovered gradually that the presence of the lamp itself arranged behavior. The light became a summons and a pact. The town would be awake enough to notice. Not all encounters were gentle. One night, a man with a different kind of grief, a man who had never learned how to ask for forgiveness, came to the porch and screamed into the dark. He flung the felt to the pavement and told the empty eaves that he had been wrong, that promises meant nothing if they were unmeasured. The sound was raw and immediate, which is a particular cruelty. It forced the neighbors to remember the sharpness of being alive. The man left the street shaking. Later, a child found the felt and smoothed it tenderly as if it were paper folded into a bird. As the repetition solidified, the town made a new kind of map. People began to tell stories about their own promises, not the catastrophic kind but small ones, to pick up milk on the way home, to call a sister on her birthday. The penny and the felt acted like a mirror, not necessarily revealing guilt, but prompting accounting. The shared attention to small promises seemed to temper the town's long habit of tidy forgetting. At the edge of those evenings there came an even smaller, sharper human encounter. A young police officer named Torres, newly assigned to the neighborhood, cautious but unsentimental, walked the cul-de-sac with a flashlight one night after a neighbor called in to report movement. He found the pennies, counted them out into his gloved hand, and placed them into an evidence bag, not because he believed in evidence, but because procedure is a language people trust. June watched him from her car and, sensing the weight of formal action on a tender thing, slowed her engine. Torres looked at the felt and at the bowl, and then at June's car. He hesitated in the way of someone who knows procedure, but also feels the pull of human curiosity. "Do you want these back in the morning?" he asked, the question an effort to stitch law to neighborhood ritual. June got out and shook her head. "Keep them," she said. "For now, let them be. Let them be what they are." The officer placed the bag in his pocket like a man carrying a small obligation and resumed his patrol. Law and ritual can live in the same town. They often do, awkwardly, like neighbors who wave but never visit. For the time being, people allowed the repetition to hold its space. At night, in rooms that faced the glow of Mr. Halloway's porch, residents found themselves rehearsing sentences they had not used in years. They wondered quietly about the nature of return, whether an answer could be given in pennies or if a promise required more than a coin on the step. The human encounters, a woman smoothing felt, a child offering a penny, an officer pocketing evidence, wove the repetition into something nearer to a community act than an isolated haunting. The host's voice might slip in here, measured and gentle, and ask, "When a pattern returns to you, do you step back or do you step forward?" It is a question that does not demand a single answer. It asks the listener to feel which motion they have chosen when small proofs arrive at their door: avoidance, curiosity, care. In that question there is the instruction of the story itself. The repeated thing is not an enemy to be chased away, nor merely a spectacle to be recorded. It is an invitation to participate in a new kind of remembering. By the time the repetition had settled into a rhythm the town could live with, the pennies had formed a small shrine on Mr. Halloway's table, and the felt had worn soft from too many hands. People stopped asking whether it was supernatural, and began to ask instead what it wanted: apology, attention, company. The question hung like a thread in the air, waiting for someone to pull at it and see what would come undone. The loosened stitch of the cul-de-sac's quiet began, in a dozen small ways, to widen. When a thing is noticed enough times, it switches registers, from anecdote to evidence, from folklore to a pile of particulars people are obliged to look at. The town's conversations stopped sliding past the house and started to settle around it like a new set of furniture. What had been polite avoidance now required language precise enough to hold the loose pieces. It began with documents, as many small reckonings do. An elderly clerk at the county records office, rummaging through the boxes in the back, because boredom and habit make some people useful, found an old parking ticket with Mr. Halloway's handwriting and a scribbled note on the back: "Jamie, green lace." The note had been folded twice and tucked with the kind of thought that says, "I will remember this when memory fails me." The discovery made its quiet rounds, not as scandal, but as a breadcrumb. June saw the ticket at the library attached to a page in a local history file and felt the room tilt. A personal item in a public archive is like a hand placed on your shoulder across a grocery aisle. A reporter from the regional paper, not the sensational kind, but the one that writes about county fairs and school budgets, called to ask if anyone would speak about the porch lamp and the pennies. He came with a notebook and a careful face, the kind of person who believes that small facts repeated make a pattern worth printing. His presence made the town consider its public self. When he walked the cul-de-sac, his recorder clicked like a metronome. Mr. Halloway answered the questions with a restraint that was the product of long practice. He sat on his bench and folded and refolded the felt in his hands, smoothing the fibers as if watching for a fault line. He told the reporter what he could, a promise, the detail about the green lace, the sound of tires on wet gravel. He did not invent the past in order to fit the shape of a story. He allowed the gaps to exist, like empty places left in a painting where the artist left the canvas bare on purpose. The town, watching through the slats of its own reticence, responded in ways both tender and bureaucratic. Some residents left small notes by the lamp. "We saw you. We are listening. You are not alone." Others argued in the private group about whether this was a sign to call in psychologists or a reason to remove the lamp altogether and return to the old habit of darkness. Someone suggested installing motion sensors. Someone else opposed the idea on the grounds that attention had already become the ritual. The debate was less about supernatural proof than about the right posture toward grief. A mother named Elaine, whose son had been 15 when he vanished 2 towns over, who had been in the habit of looking out of her kitchen window at odd hours, read the article on a slow morning and felt the hollow of coincidence pull like a tide. She came with keys in her hand and a small tin box. Inside it were postcards her son had sent years ago, scribbled with jokes and bad drawings. She placed the box on Mr. Halloway's table and folded her hands as if in prayer. The gesture was not melodramatic, it was, in its economy, a human thing to do when the world offers a place to put a private ache. As these human acts accumulated, official channels reluctantly warmed. Officer Torres, who had been the pragmatic presence in the second section, filed a small report after a resident requested clarity. He wrote down dates and times and included Mr. Halloway's testimony. The report was methodical rather than mystical, sightings, artifacts, notes. It sat for a week in a drawer with several other mundane things. Then a detective from a neighbouring precinct called the file in for a look. Detectives, trained to see patterns where others see oddity, will follow the trail of small proofs the way a hound follows scent. Detective Reyes, who had the kind of patience that reads a ledger for feel, came not to make proclamations but to ask slow questions. He moved through the cul-de-sac like someone working a careful instrument, his boots soft on fallen leaves. He asked about family members, schedules, and recent visitors. He looked at the pennies and tapped them with a pencil, the way someone tests the lines of a map. He listened to recordings and watched neighbours' footage. He never spoke of ghosts. He spoke instead of proximity, of timelines and possible witnesses. His human encounter with Mr. Halloway was quiet and practical. They sat at the kitchen table as leaves scraped the windows. The detective had a tepid thermos of coffee, and Mr. Halloway produced a tin of biscuits with the economy of someone who had learned how to offer in small increments. "I'm not here to tell you not to light the lamp," Reyes said, and the phrase was not a rebuke, but a permission. "I'm here to understand what we all agree is happening." Mr. Halloway placed the felt on the table between them. "It comes in pieces," he said. "A coin, a scrap, sometimes a hum in the night." He did not ask for the detective to do more than listen. And listen Reyes did. with the careful attention of someone cataloguing evidence that might rearrange itself into a truth. "You said green lace?" Reyes asked, from the leather of his note. Mr. Halloway repeated the detail as if the green was itself a tether. Detective Reyes left with a small roll of film in a plastic pouch and a promise to follow up. The promise was courteous and procedural, the kind of containment towns rely on when ambiguity blooms into public concern. But it also reopened memory. Neighbors who had been avoiding conversations about the past now found themselves compelled to talk. It is remarkable how a polite, official promise can unstick private silences. There were other ruptures: a girl from high school, Tara, who collected ephemera and who liked the grammar of old things, pried open a thicket near the creek and found, half buried under moss, a small length of green shoelace with a frayed end. She brought it, trembling with the poetic pleasure of discovery, to June at the library. The lace matched the description from the parking ticket. It was an index finger pointing at a year of grief. Tara did not shout the find across the town green. She wrapped the lace in tissue and tucked it in her blazer pocket like a relic, then offered it to Mr. Halloway with a quiet humility that felt more honest than any grand gesture. When neighbors were shown the lace, faces shifted in a way that made the air thinner. People had to make decisions about what to believe and how to act on it. A man who had never thought to speak of faults stood at the post office and told his wife he had seen tires on gravel that night and thought nothing of it. A woman who had been a neighbor and kept her memories like a private garden suddenly remembered knocking on a door years ago and hearing a muffled sound that she had never named out loud. The unraveling did not collapse the town into hysteria. It did something quieter and perhaps more consequential. It rearranged the social ledger. People who had relied on silence to be polite were forced to account for what they might have left undone. It was not accusatory so much as reckonable. The town realized that keeping the porch light dark had not erased the past. It had merely made it a private burden. Mr. Halloway, with the small, steadying rituals he had adopted, the lamp, the biscuit tin, the bowl of coins, began, slowly, to speak to people he had once kept at polite distance. He went to the coffee shop in the mornings and answered questions with the soft sturdiness of someone who had been practicing the muscle of being present. A woman who had been his neighbor years earlier confessed over a latte that she had seen a small car back out that night and had assumed nothing. She had assumed madness and left the memory on a shelf. When she admitted it, the air in the cafe seemed to lurch as if the floor had tilted. The host's voice slips in here in the same measured way it has before, and asks not to adjudicate, but to make a listener self-aware. When the past asks for attention, who do we think should listen? The neighbors, the police, the person who believes the most. It's a question that opens rather than closes. It asks the listener to notice where their own sympathies incline. In the end, the town found that listening had a social cost. It required people to make their private memories public enough to be useful. At the heart of this unraveling was a small human insistence that forgetting is not the same as absolution. The cul-de-sac learned a new grammar for its compassion. There were neighborly visits and uncomfortable conferences, and a small town meeting in the church basement where people passed around tissues and spoke, haltingly, of loose promises and ways of making them right. There was no tidy resolution. The tightness of guilt loosened into the practice of attention. The evidence had not produced a singular culprit or a courtroom scene. It had produced something more and less than that. A town that had to learn to hold the past without pretending it would fold up neatly. The final human turn of this section is quiet and intimate. One night, when the moon had washed the street in dishwater light, Mr. Halloway found on his table a small envelope. Inside was a note folded twice. I remember, I am sorry. J. The handwriting was thin and familiar. It did not claim to fix anything. It leaned toward the possibility that small admissions have the real power. Mr. Halloway sat with the note in his palm and, for the first time since the boy under the eaves had spoken, allowed himself to hold a small thing that was not his to carry alone. The town had not solved the mystery. It had only learned that some mysteries are less about answers than about what you do when an answer is not enough. The unraveling was not a single event, but a process, a series of human actions stitched into civic life. In those stitches, the community found a way to practice a different kind of remembering, one that accepts the ache, gives it a table to rest on, and asks aloud who will sit with it. When the town moved from noticing to acting, it did so in the small, sensible ways that towns prefer: casseroles, an extra lawnmower run for the elderly, a volunteer schedule for snow shoveling. Habits are how communities translate feeling into practice. In the cul-de-sac, habit became the work of being present, leaving a bowl of coins, sitting with a cup of tea on an evening bench, lighting the lamp, not as defiance, but as an invitation. The bowl on Mr. Halloway's table grew. Coins nested together like small moons, copper and silver, and sometimes the gloss of a foreign piece no one could identify. People stopped treating the pennies as evidence and began treating them as offerings. Gestures meant as much for the giver as for whoever or whatever accepted them. A wedding ring slipped into the bowl one day, not because someone thought it belonged there, but because a woman who no longer wore hers wanted, in a practical and unperformative way, to make a gesture of solidarity. Whatever private ledger once kept guilt in a small drawer loosened into a public accounting. The town discovered that public accounting did not require a theatre. It required time and patience and ordinary kindness. There were awkward moments, of course, old resentments that had been smoothed over by silence, surfaced like blistered paint when rubbed. People who had been neighbours for decades found their memories in partial conflict, and conflict needs a new grammar to be gentle. That grammar was mostly built in kitchen tables and in the church basement. A community meeting convened not in the heat of accusation, but in the soft light of reconciliation. People passed a microphone not to make a case, but to confess small details they had never aired aloud. The night they had closed the blinds too quickly, the time they had seen a car back up on Mill Street and assumed it was a delivery, a pair of hands that had helped carry a crate and then left. The admissions were often banal and therefore surprisingly wrenching. A detail can be as heavy as a verdict when it is the missing tile in a mosaic. At one of these gatherings, someone suggested that if memory wanted a place to land, perhaps the town could offer something sturdier than anonymous coins. They proposed a simple stone marker to be set at the base of the lamp, a small, unostentatious thing engraved only with the words, "We remember." The idea was practical and human in its humility. A man who worked at the stonemason's shop volunteered to carve it in his spare hours. Others offered labour or sandwiches to the crew. The marker became a project that required no spectacle, only steady hands. When the stone was set, there was a modest, informal ceremony. Children from the elementary school, some with parents who had been part of the original forgetting, some too young to remember any of it, came and placed tiny pebbles around the base. A choir sang one hymn badly and affectionately. It sounded like neighbours trying on reverence. People brought notes and photographs and tucked them into a hollow at the stone's back, where they thought of them as private gifts to the past. Mr. Halloway stood with his hands folded, the lamp above him making a cradle of light the size of a dinner plate. The human encounters that followed were smaller and quieter than anyone had expected. A woman in her 70s, Mary, who had lived on the cul-de-sac all her life and had been a neighbour to the family once, came and lingered by the bench. She had the kind of slow speech that knits a tale as it goes. People assumed she had stories to tell. She had stories, sure, but none that required the sensational. In her hand was a small envelope she had carried for decades. She set it on the bench between her and Mr. Halloway, and then walked away before anyone could pry the seal. When Mr. Halloway opened the envelope that night at home, the handwriting inside made his chest constrict with an old, particular ache. The paper held a short note. "I remember. I am sorry. J." The single initial was no revelation in itself. The town had always had letters signed this way tucked into community mailboxes. But for Mr. Halloway, the letter landed like the last necessary thread, tucking him back into the fabric of a story he had been carrying alone. That same week, a woman with a name the town had not heard, linked to the childhood photographs, Joanna, came to stand at the lamp. She was younger than the people who remembered the first night, but old enough to have the kind of tenderness that carries private histories with it. She approached the bench as if the bench were a place one might sit with a confession. Her hands trembled only slightly when she set down a small paper bag and placed it near the bowl. People watched and gave the kind of space communities have learned to give, not an absence, but a respectful window. June walked over and sat at the edge of the crowd. No one pushed. The gesture of coming was, in itself, a form of admission. Joanna cleared her throat in a voice that was not practiced for public performance. "I used to come around here," she said, which is to say less than she might have, and thereby let inference do the rest of the work. She told, haltingly, a human story that was subtle and ordinary and therefore unbearably truthful. She had been a teenage neighbor once, a girl who had been in and out of houses and who had held a package, carried a message, made errands. She had loved the small domesticities of others the way some people love knitting patterns. She had once known the feel of a fox mask seam beneath her thumb. She told of a night when she had run an errand for someone she loved, an adult who had been hurried, restless, and charming in ways that made small obligations feel like confidences. She said plainly, and with no grand flourish, that she had been asked to hold a child on the porch while the adult stepped to the car, and that she had told the child she would be right there. Then she said this, lowering her head, so people's faces blurred into a crowd. "I left for a moment to get a shoelace. I thought I'd be back in a minute. I heard the car shift, and then I heard nothing. I came back and there was only the coat, and I have been living with that for 30 years. What she offered the town was not a tidy confession so much as a human accounting. She did not demand absolution. She did not try to paint herself angelic. Her voice held the kind of small, brittle honesty that can make a room move from curiosity to tenderness. Someone in the crowd, a man who had been young when the town pledged silence, asked quietly, "Did you tell them? At the time?" The question was not meant to sting. It was an attempt to understand what memory had been folded into. "No," Joanna said. "I told the person I was with. They said not to make a scene, that it was an accident. I was afraid. I was young and she was older, and we thought maybe we could fix it later." She pressed her fingers together in a way that made it clear she had been mending something forever. Detective Reyes, who had kept a gentle presence through the unravelling, took Joanna aside afterward. The encounter between detective and confessor was formal in its necessity and human in its awkwardness. She handed him a small folded scrap of fabric, the green lace, admittedly faded but still legible against the palm. "I found this when I cleaned out a bag a long time later," she said. "I never thought I could bear to show it." The detective's hands were careful when he took it. He did not look triumphant. He looked tired, as if the case had at last been moved from rumour into record. Records were made, statements were taken where people could be brave enough to speak. But in the small moral geography of the cul-de-sac, something else happened quietly. People stopped treating the past as an item to be hidden and learned slowly, clumsily, how to be accountable in the unglamorous, everyday ways that make a neighbourhood safer. A few consequences were practical. Old wounds reopened enough for the town to consider legal channels. Insurance claims were revisited. Names that had been misfiled were corrected in public registries. But more significant than paperwork were the small human restitutions. A man who had been away for years, Jay's son, it turned out, came back and stood by the stone. He listened to neighbours who had stories and offered apologies that sounded like work rather than performance. Some people accepted what they were offered, others did not. The town, having moved from silence to speech, had to live with the whole spectrum. The last nights in the cul-de-sac did not all belong to tidy closure. Not every heart mended. There were people for whom the weight of what had been could not be eased, and those absences were real and stubborn. But there was movement, cups of tea shared, apologies that were not theatrical but quotidian, the thin sweetness of neighbours learning how to be present to one another again. The final scene that attends any such long, small reckoning is rarely dramatic. It is often a simple human encounter, a child leaving a penny on a step, and a grown person meeting her halfway with a shoelace and a word. One rainy evening, when the lamp cast a pool on the wet pavement, Mr. Halloway and Joanna met at the bench. They did not speak much. Speech sometimes proves too eager. Instead, they sat and let the rain map small, cool rivers down their sleeves. Joanna reached into her coat and left a tiny bundle of shoelaces beside the bowl. "For what it's worth," she said, with a smile that was more apology than explanation. Mr. Halloway accepted the laces with a slow nod. The movement was practical and ceremonial at once. He did not say the things that holy books use to cleanse. He thanked her simply, which in that quiet street was perhaps the most considerable thing to do. The host's voice, finally, as the episode moves toward its close, leans in the way it always does. Gentle, attentive, a little weary, like someone who has stayed up with you through a long story. It asks the listener not for answers, but for reflection. When a community remembers, what does it owe the people who carried those memories alone? How do we make space for both apology and restraint? Who are we willing to sit with on the bench while the rain goes by? There is no tidy moral delivered in the end. The cul-de-sac remains a place with a lamp, a stone that reads "We remember," and a bowl of coins that will likely keep growing for years. People will still forget sometimes. They will fail to recognize the weight of an elbow or the absence that hangs at a table. But the town has learned a new practice, which is the slowest kind of hope: showing up. The final image is quiet and small and therefore stays. A child tucking a penny into the bowl, a shoelace tied into a careful knot, two people on a bench with wet sleeves and no more need to keep their grief wrapped alone. The light from the lamp spills across them like a plain hand, and the street, for once, seems to keep its promises in the way it once forgot them, by the small, steady work of neighbours. The burned house on Mill Street had been abandoned for years, a skeleton of charred timbers and cracked windows that seemed to watch the street with vacant, blackened eyes. Children dared each other to peek inside, running afterward with shrieks that mixed fear and excitement, while adults steered their cars wide around the bend, some crossing the street entirely to avoid passing under its sagging eaves. The house had become a place of curious familiarity. Everyone had seen it. Few truly understood it. Every October, a pumpkin appeared on its porch. No one ever saw who placed it, but it arrived with a candle lit inside, its hollow grin facing the street. Each year the face was different, a crooked smile, a jagged row of eyes, an abstract gash of a mouth. The flame inside made the blackened wood appear almost tender, as if the house was still keeping a private hearth, despite its ruin. One damp October evening, Mara walked home from a friend's house, her jacket collar turned up against the light drizzle. Her thoughts flitted between the math test she was ignoring and the way the streetlights blurred in the rain. The burned house drew her attention as always. Something about its stillness pulled her forward. Children had long outgrown the dares, and yet she felt the familiar tug, a private invitation to approach. She crouched on the cracked sidewalk, peering into the pumpkin's hollow. The candlelight danced across the rough interior, and for a brief moment she thought she saw her own reflection. She blinked. The reflection blinked back, but not quite like her. There was a faint seam along the cheek, a strange stitching that curved unnaturally from ear to chin, making the mouth look repaired. The eyes, though hers, held a tired patience she could not recognize. Startled, Mara stumbled back. A voice behind her broke the quiet night. "What's up?" It was Jonah, a friend who thrived on dares and late-night adventures. He leaned closer, eyes widening. "That's my grandmother," he whispered. Mara turned toward him, confused. Jonah explained that his grandmother had been the town's seamstress, known for darning collars and making Halloween costumes with meticulous care. She had died years ago, yet here, in the pumpkin's reflection, some echo of her presence seemed to appear, overlaid with Mara's own image. The intersection of memory and reflection made the air heavier. Mara felt the seam in the reflected mouth like a foreign stitch she hadn't been taught to mend. Jonah's whisper confirmed the uncanny, small details of a life once lived, somehow pressed into the light of a candle and a hollowed pumpkin. In the days that followed, Mara couldn't stop thinking about the reflection. Every small, ordinary thing she noticed, an abandoned spool of thread, a neighbour's thimble left by the fence, suddenly felt significant. She began to pass the stoop deliberately, watching for the pumpkin and its subtle, uncanny glow. The house's ruin framed these small offerings, making them feel like proof that the world still held memory, even when people forgot. One evening, Jonah brought his grandmother's thimble and placed it at the pumpkin's base. He didn't speak, simply stood and watched as the candlelight flickered against the charred wood. Mrs. Alden, who ran the local bakery, slipped a small note into the pumpkin. "We remember." The human gestures began to accumulate. Each one was simple and deliberate: a ribbon, a note, a sprig of rosemary, a small charm. They required no explanation, only the quiet presence of someone willing to tend to memory. The burned house, once a symbol of absence, became a center of attention, not for ghosts, but for what people chose to remember. Mara noticed that the pumpkin's reflection shifted depending on who approached. When Jonah left the thimble, the reflected mouth tightened as if acknowledging a shared laugh. When Harold, a retired firefighter, placed a sprig of rosemary, the reflected eyes brightened with recognition. Even the smallest gestures, a child's charm or a handwritten note, seemed to ripple through the reflected image, creating a fragile web of memory and attention. The stoop's gatherings were unplanned. Neighbors came and went, leaving small tokens, offering quiet gestures, standing silently under the streetlight. There were no rituals, no grand performances, only human acts of presence and remembrance. Even when a few teenagers tried to provoke laughter with reckless noise, the older observers quietly reminded them that the place demanded care, and the lesson was absorbed without confrontation. June, the librarian, began keeping a journal of the objects left at the stoop. She recorded ribbons, thimbles, notes, and glimpses of reflections, noting the weather, moon phases, and the subtle movements of neighbors. Each small offering became part of a growing story of attentive care, a way for the town to reconcile memory with presence. The host's voice might pause here, gentle and intimate, asking the listener, "If you could leave something at a place meant to remember, what would it be? A ribbon, a note, a small charm? And who would see it after you?" Mara continued to add small objects of her own, a scrap of ribbon, a cheap plastic charm, tiny fragments that revealed more about her than she intended. Each act was a way of participating in the stoop's quiet communion, a ritual that repaired memory without spectacle and invited others to do the same. The burned house was no longer merely a ruin. It had become a place of quiet attention, a modest hearth where small human gestures, spools of thread, thimbles, rosemary, charms, created a fragile, living network of remembrance. In the reflection of the pumpkin, the stitched face, the candlelight, and the quiet acts of attention, the town began to practice a new, tender kind of remembering. The October evenings stretched thin, wet, and cold, the kind of nights that made breath visible and footsteps heavier than usual. Mara found herself walking the same route home repeatedly, her curiosity now no longer simple fascination, but a tether pulling her toward the burned house. Each evening she carried something new, a ribbon she had cut from an old costume, a chipped charm from a vending machine, a small scrap of paper with her own clumsy sketches. She arranged each item carefully at the pumpkin's base, wondering if, somehow, the act of leaving it there made her part of something larger than herself. Jonah began joining her on these walks. He was quieter than usual, his usual bravado tempered by a reverence for the small, accumulating offerings. He carried a thimble or a spool of thread, or sometimes nothing at all, simply standing near Mara as they watched the flickering candlelight reflect off the charred wood. "Do you think it sees us?" Mara asked one evening, half in jest, half in fear. Jonah hesitated. "I don't know," he said, "but it feels like it's listening. Somehow the reflection, someone's been keeping it alive." The pumpkin's hollow grin, lit from within, had become more than a playful face. It had become a mirror for memory and grief. The seam along the reflected cheek that Mara had first noticed had not disappeared. It had grown more distinct, more intricate, as though each small gesture left at the stoop pressed into the reflection like thread in a tapestry. Sometimes when Mara leaned in, she thought she saw not just the faint seam, but the edges of another face, someone else's eyes beneath the flickering light, observing, remembering. Other neighbors began leaving offerings too, their acts small and unassuming, but deeply human. Mrs. Alden's notes became a nightly ritual, sometimes a word, sometimes a brief story of her own childhood. Harold left rosemary or lavender from his small garden, each sprig carefully trimmed and laid, as if it were a hand reaching out. Even June, the librarian, contributed more than just her journal entries. She brought things she found at estate sales, a tiny ceramic bird, a thimble embossed with a flower, a lace handkerchief folded neatly. Each contribution built a mosaic of memory that was both intimate and communal. One evening, as rain fell in thin threads across Mill Street, a new figure appeared. A woman in her late 20s, with hair pulled back and a soft, deliberate way of moving, approached the stoop. She carried a small, weathered bag that rattled faintly. Mara and Jonah watched from a distance. The woman knelt carefully, pulled a folded scrap of fabric from the bag, and placed it beside the pumpkin. Jonah whispered, "Who is she?" Mara shook her head. "I don't know, but I think she belongs here." The woman lingered, her gaze moving from the pumpkin to the gathered items around it, as if cataloguing decades of memory in a single glance. Mara felt an odd recognition, the sensation that this stranger's presence belonged in the stoop's quiet network of attention. She wanted to speak but did not know what to say. Sometimes words felt too clumsy to match the act of leaving a gift. The host's voice might interject here, gentle and reflective. Have you ever felt the need to leave a part of yourself somewhere? A memory, an object, or a gesture meant for someone you may never meet? What would you leave if you could trust it to be remembered? The question lingers as an invitation, soft and deliberate, like the light flickering inside the pumpkin. The nights grew colder, and the pumpkin's candlelight became a small hearth in the darkness. Mara noticed that her reflection no longer frightened her. It had become familiar, an uncanny companion in her nightly walks. The seam along the cheek seemed less a wound and more a connection, a visible trace of memory stitched into her perception. She began to imagine the house not as a burned ruin, but as a keeper of stories, each charred beam holding the echoes of lives once lived. Jonah confided one night that he had started to dream about the stoop. In his dreams, the reflection did not just show faces, it spoke in subtle gestures, bending toward those who approached, acknowledging each gift, each note, each small offering. Mara laughed softly at the thought, but she too had begun to notice traces of the dream in her waking life. A breeze that seemed to move objects just slightly, a flicker of light that made a ribbon tremble, a sense that the stoop's attention was not passive but responsive. The woman with the bag returned several times over the next week, each time leaving something different. A small pair of gloves, a folded photograph, a note written in delicate cursive. She never spoke, but Mara began to recognize her presence as part of the stoop's rhythm. One evening, as Mara placed a ribbon beside the pumpkin, the woman's gaze met hers. Mara's breath caught. The woman's expression was calm but intense, a quiet acknowledgement that Mara's actions mattered, that each act of leaving was a conversation with memory itself. Neighbors who had previously avoided the burned house began to notice the nightly gatherings. Some came silently, leaving small objects and standing back. Others watched from windows, curious but cautious. The stoop became a nexus, not for spectacle or rumor, but for attentive care, a place where human presence and memory intertwined. Mara observed, quietly fascinated, how the community's actions created a shared narrative that no single person controlled. One rainy evening, Harold approached Mara and Jonah with a small, weathered shoebox. He placed it gently at the stoop's base, and inside were dozens of tiny items: buttons, scraps of fabric, a miniature thimble, each carefully labelled with dates or initials. "I've been keeping these for years," he said quietly. "Things that didn't belong anywhere else. Maybe they belong here." The three of them knelt together, arranging the contents of the box around the pumpkin. Mara felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the people beside her, but to all those who had ever passed through the stoop, leaving small, intimate fragments of their lives. The reflection in the pumpkin seemed to shimmer more vividly. The seam along the cheek, now a lattice of memory, connecting past, present, and perhaps even future. In the weeks that followed, the stoop's nightly ritual became a subtle social gravity. Children who had once feared the burned house now walked past it with curiosity, leaving tiny gifts, a pebble, a pressed leaf, a hand-drawn picture. Adults stopped briefly on their way home, sometimes speaking in hushed tones, sometimes standing silently, participating in the quiet act of remembrance. Mara realized that what had started as a personal fascination had grown into something communal. The burned house, the pumpkin, the reflections, and the small objects had created a space where people could confront memory without judgment, where grief, love, and curiosity could coexist in quiet harmony. The host's voice, calm and intimate, might ask the listener again, when we leave parts of ourselves in a place that remembers, do we find closure? Or do we discover that memory needs only acknowledgement to live? How would you participate in such a quiet communion? And so the burned house remained, its charred beams holding 1,000 small stories. The pumpkin flickered each night, a small living mirror reflecting the community's care. Mara, Jonah, Harold, and the woman with the bag became regular visitors, each contributing fragments of memory, each participating in a ritual that was human, tender, and enduring. In this way, the stoop transformed from a place of ruin into a place of connection, teaching the town that remembrance is not just an act of looking back, it is a practice carried out in small, deliberate gestures and witnessed by those willing to notice. Each night, Mara would pause before placing her offering, her reflection smiling back at her with the stitched cheek. She wondered, how many people had left something tonight? How many memories had been touched? And always the candle flickered as if in answer, illuminating the threads that connected everyone who had ever paused at the stoop, leaving a part of themselves behind. The stoop had become a quiet testament that even in burned and broken places, human attention, care, and memory could thrive, stitched together by the smallest gestures, the softest reflections, and the presence of those willing to notice. By mid-October, the nights had become colder, and the wind carried a damp sharpness that made Mara pull her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Yet still, she walked to Mill Street, her pockets heavy with small objects, ribbons, buttons, scraps of fabric, sometimes even photographs she had copied from her own family albums. She was no longer just visiting the stoop, she had become part of its rhythm, an unspoken participant in a nightly ritual of remembrance that grew with each passing week. The burned house, blackened and hollowed, seemed to pulse faintly in the candlelight. The pumpkin's grin had taken on a peculiar solidity, the reflection within it more distinct than ever. The seam along the cheek, once a faint trace, had deepened, weaving into the contours of the reflected face, creating a lattice that suggested not just repair, but connection. Mara sometimes wondered if the seam itself was alive, stretching and adjusting with every gift left on the stoop. Jonah walked beside her one evening, carrying an old thimble from his grandmother's collection. "Do you think anyone ever notices us?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Mara shook her head. "I don't think it matters. Maybe it only matters to the things we leave behind, not to anyone watching." She paused, looking at the pumpkin's hollow grin. "Do you ever feel like it sees more than we realize?" Jonah hesitated. "I've been thinking the same thing. It's like it's alive, but not in the way we understand. More like memory itself is alive, and the pumpkin is just its vessel." That night, a gust of wind rattled the charred boards of the house, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and something else, something sweet, like baking bread or crushed rosemary. Mara's reflection shimmered in the candlelight, the seam along her cheek catching the glow like a line of molten gold. She bent closer, studying the face within the pumpkin. For the first time, she thought she saw movement behind the reflection. Subtle shifts of eyes, a turn of a mouth, a blink that did not quite match her own. Harold appeared then, stepping carefully onto the wet sidewalk. He carried a small sprig of lavender this time, placing it beside the pumpkin with meticulous care. "It's the little things that matter," he said, almost to himself. "The tiny gestures we can control, the memories we can honor." Mara noticed how the reflection shifted as Harold placed the lavender. The eyes seemed to focus, not on her, not on him, but somewhere deeper. inside the collection of objects, inside the thread of human attention that now wrapped the stoop like a quiet, fragile web. The woman with the bag returned that night as well. She carried a small, tattered doll, its cloth body worn and stitched multiple times over. She placed it near the pumpkin, kneeling long enough to adjust its posture so that it appeared to gaze into the candlelight. Mara watched her movements closely. There was a deliberate care in everything the woman did, as if each gesture were a sentence in a silent conversation. "Do you think she comes every year?" Mara whispered to Jonah. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe she only comes when she feels something's missing, some memory that needs tending." The stoop had begun to draw more attention from the neighborhood. Children on bicycles slowed as they passed, curious about the growing collection of objects. Some left their own small gifts, a pebble, a pressed leaf, a scribbled note. Adults paused during evening walks, occasionally standing silently at the curb, recognizing the ritual but unsure how to participate. Each act, no matter how small, seemed to pulse through the candlelight, affecting the reflection in the pumpkin. June, ever meticulous, continued to document each gift. Her journal had grown thick, filled with careful notes, sketches, and reflections. She recorded the weather, the number of gifts, the names of those who had left offerings, and subtle shifts she noticed in the pumpkin's reflection. Over time, she began to see patterns. Certain objects caused the reflection to shift in ways others did not. Specific colors or textures seemed to make the face inside the pumpkin more expressive, almost human in its subtle gestures. One night, Mara decided to leave something deeply personal, a small photograph of her childhood bedroom, where the walls were painted a soft blue, and the curtains had always caught the sunlight just so. She folded it carefully and placed it in the hollow of the pumpkin, her fingers brushing the carved edges. She stepped back and waited. The candle flickered, and for a heartbeat, the reflection shifted. Not her face, not anyone else's, but a composite of both, overlaid with the memories of every object left before. The seam along the cheek had multiplied, a lattice of care and memory, binding the past and present together. The host's voice might ask here, "Have you ever felt that an object could hold more than itself? A memory, a moment, a fragment of someone else's life? What would you leave if you could ensure it mattered?" Jonah, noticing Mara's fascination, asked softly, "Do you think it remembers us too?" She considered the question, feeling the weight of the night, the candle, and the silent witnesses, the people who had passed by, the children, the neighbors. "I don't know," she said finally. "Maybe it only remembers the care we give, not the ones we are." As the nights wore on, the stoop's small ritual began to take on a life of its own. Even the burned house seemed to lean in closer, its blackened beams softening in the glow of multiple candles. Each object left, a thimble, a ribbon, a sprig of lavender, a photograph, a doll, was absorbed into a quiet network of memory that seemed to extend beyond the street, beyond the neighborhood, into something larger, something intangible, yet palpable. One night, Mara noticed something she hadn't before. A shadow moving across the wall behind the house. It was subtle, flickering with the candlelight, like the projection of a memory too deep to be fully formed. She blinked. Jonah was there too, watching. "Did you see that?" she whispered. He nodded. "I think it's all of them. Everyone who's left something here. Maybe this is how they linger, how memory takes shape." The human encounters continued, layering upon one another. Children learned to leave objects with care, not out of fear, but from a sense of participation. Adults who had long avoided the burned house began leaving things, a scarf, a folded note, a small trinket, sometimes anonymously, sometimes quietly, introducing themselves to Mara or Jonah. Each person who participated became a thread in the growing fabric of remembrance, each gesture a stitch in the lattice that the pumpkin's reflection now mirrored with uncanny clarity. Mara began to notice that the reflection sometimes shifted before she even left an object, as if the pumpkin anticipated the act. She watched as the lattice of seams and faces seemed to stretch, accommodating each offering, acknowledging it, folding it into the collective memory. The sensation was eerie, yes, but also tender, a reminder that memory is not merely passive. It lives in attention, in care, in human presence. Harold, the retired firefighter, became something of a mentor to the younger participants. He taught them to place objects carefully, to consider their intention, to respect the stoop's quiet atmosphere. "It's not about the thing itself," he said one evening, adjusting a ribbon. "It's about the act, the offering. The smallest gesture can matter more than 1,000 words." The woman with the bag, who had never spoken, continued to return with small, carefully chosen items. Mara began to wonder if she was older than she appeared, if perhaps she had been attending the stoop for years. Mara felt a pang of curiosity and longing. She wanted to know the woman's story, but somehow asking seemed intrusive. The stoop thrived in unspoken understanding, in the quiet communion of objects and attention. One night, as the wind gusted through Mill Street, Mara knelt beside the pumpkin and whispered, almost to herself, "Thank you for seeing us." The candle flickered violently for a heartbeat and then calmed. The reflection shimmered, the seam along the cheek, bending and folding like a river of light. For a moment, Mara felt a presence, not frightening, not threatening, but profoundly aware, acknowledging the network of memory and care that had formed around the stoop. The host's voice might gently remind the listener here. Sometimes to be remembered is not to be seen, but to be witnessed. What small gestures would you leave for someone, or something, to witness you? And what would it feel like to know it remembers? That night, Mara left a final ribbon, a deep indigo strip torn from a dress she had once loved. She tucked it carefully beside the pumpkin, feeling the weight of her own life intertwined with the quiet lives of the neighbors, the objects, and the flickering candlelight. Jonah stood silently beside her. Harold adjusted a small sprig of rosemary, and the woman with the bag simply watched, her eyes reflecting the lattice of faces in the pumpkin. The stoop had become more than a burned house, more than a hollowed pumpkin. It was a living archive of memory, stitched together by small human acts of attention, care, and remembrance. Each night, Mara saw the faces of the past and present in the flame. Children she had never met, neighbors she barely knew, friends she had grown with, and even herself, layered in the reflection, bound by the seams of memory and the careful offerings left in devotion. And in that shared, fragile space, the burned house whispered, not in words, but in the soft glow of candlelight, in the lattice of seams, in the quiet network of human attention, that memory lives where we choose to tend it, and that even the smallest gestures can stitch the past into the present with unbroken care. The nights of late October carried a stillness that seemed almost sacred, broken only by the occasional gust of wind rustling the leaves along Mill Street or the distant bark of a dog. Mara's footsteps on the damp sidewalk were deliberate, measured, almost ritualistic, as if the act of walking to the burned house were part of the offering itself. The stoop had become a place of quiet gravity where time slowed, and the flickering candlelight inside the pumpkin reflected not just faces, but moments of care, fragments of memory, and the tender weight of human attention. The pumpkin's hollow grin had grown familiar, its features shifting subtly with each object left, each gesture made, each presence observed. The seam along the cheek, now intricate and luminous in the candlelight, seemed to hold together not just her own reflection, but all of the human acts that had been contributed over the past weeks. Mara found herself staring longer, leaning closer, feeling almost as if the lattice of seams were a conversation, a living dialogue connecting her, Jonah, Harold, the woman with the bag, and all who had come before. Jonah was beside her that night, unusually quiet, holding nothing in his hands. "Do you ever wonder," he said softly, "if all of this, every ribbon, note, object, it's shaping the reflection, or if the reflection is shaping us?" Mara considered the question, noting the candlelight trembling across the charred boards. "I think it's both," she said finally. "We leave pieces of ourselves here, and in return, we become part of something larger, something we can't quite define." The woman with the bag appeared again, moving slowly along the sidewalk, carrying a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. She knelt beside the pumpkin, placing it carefully next to the scattered objects, and lingered a moment longer than usual. Mara noticed a faint movement in the candlelight, a subtle shift that made the seams along the reflected cheek glimmer like a network of tiny veins. For a brief instant, Mara thought she saw multiple faces overlapping in the reflection, hers, Jonah's, Harold's, the seamstress's long-gone face, and others she could not identify. The act of leaving something had become a meditation, a ritual that asked little and offered much. Mara extended her hand, placing a small photograph of her mother's childhood home next to the pumpkin. The image was ordinary, but to Mara it carried the gravity of love, memory, and absence. She stepped back, watching, as the candlelight flickered over it. The seams in the reflection shifted again, a lattice rearranging itself to accommodate the new memory. Harold spoke then, in his steady, measured voice. "It's remarkable," he said, "how the smallest objects carry so much weight. A ribbon, a thimble, a note. They're more than themselves. They are bridges between what was and what remains." Mara nodded, noticing that the reflection seemed to pulse with recognition, responding not with words, but with subtle movements, a gentle acknowledgement of the care invested in the offerings. The stoop had become a nightly gathering, though few spoke aloud. Children left trinkets and drawings, learning, perhaps instinctively, that the act of giving mattered more than explanation. Adults approached quietly, sometimes lingering at a distance, sometimes kneeling to leave objects, contributing to the delicate lattice of memory forming on the charred porch. Each gift, no matter how small, rippled through the reflection, weaving new threads into the existing network. Mara began noticing more subtle details. A faint scent of lavender that seemed to drift from Harold's sprigs, the soft scratch of pencil on paper as June documented each object, the way the woman with the bag adjusted items with meticulous care. These small gestures accumulated, layered upon each other, creating a quiet rhythm that defined the stoop's presence on Mill Street. The burned house itself seemed to participate in this rhythm, the blackened beams softening in the candlelight, the wind carrying the faint echo of human movement and attention. One particularly cold evening, Mara paused to study the reflection in the pumpkin. The seam along the cheek now appeared almost alive, a lattice that shifted and folded with the objects left before it. For a fleeting moment, she saw a new detail. A child's eyes, wide with curiosity, peering from the reflection, though she could not identify whose they were. It was a reminder that memory was not static, that the reflection contained traces of everyone who had passed through, and perhaps even those who would come in the future. Jonah crouched beside her, his breath visible in the chill air. "Do you think it remembers the people who aren't here anymore?" he asked. Mara considered this. The burned house, the pumpkin, the lattice of seams. It seemed to hold the echoes of absent lives, of neighbors long gone, of memories almost forgotten. "I think it does," she said. "But maybe it doesn't matter whether it remembers or not. Maybe it matters that we remember, that we honor the moments we have and the people who shaped them." The woman with the bag left a final object that night. A small, worn photograph of the seamstress herself, carefully folded and placed at the center of the collection. Mara and Jonah stepped back, sensing the gravity of the gesture. The candlelight flickered across the lattice of seams, and for a moment all the faces seemed to merge into one, a tapestry of memory, care, and attention that transcended individual identity. The host's voice might ask here, in its calm and reflective tone, what does it mean to leave a part of yourself somewhere, to trust that memory will receive it? How do we honor the quiet spaces where attention and care accumulate, unseen yet profoundly felt? That night, Mara and Jonah lingered longer than usual. They watched as the flame trembled, as the reflections shifted, as the lattice of seams held together all the fragments of human presence. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if to respect the ritual, as if Mill Street itself had learned to slow its pace in recognition of the quiet acts unfolding on the stoop. June's journal had grown thick, pages filled with notes, sketches, observations, and reflections. She began leaving small annotations beside the objects themselves, documenting subtle changes in the reflection, shifts in the lattice of seams, and the movements of those who participated in the ritual. Her meticulous attention created yet another layer of memory, a record that both celebrated and preserved the quiet significance of the stoop. The neighborhood itself began to change subtly. People who had once crossed the street to avoid the burned house now approached with deliberate care. Children learned the rhythm of offerings, adults discovered a sense of reverent curiosity, and the collective attention wove a delicate web that connected past, present, and future. The stoop was no longer a place of fear or neglect. It had become a center of human attention, a quiet altar to memory and care. One night, Mara lingered alone, her fingers brushing the ribbon she had left earlier. The candle flickered, casting shadows across the charred wood, and for a moment she felt the presence of all who had participated. She could almost hear their unspoken thoughts, their quiet gestures, their contributions to the lattice of memory that the pumpkin reflected. She wondered if this was what it meant to be part of something larger than oneself. A fragile, living network of attention, care, and remembrance. Harold joined her then, placing a small sprig of rosemary beside the objects. He said nothing, simply adjusted the placement with care. Mara felt a profound sense of connection, realizing that the stoop had become more than a burned house, more than a hollow pumpkin. It was a living archive of human attention, stitched together by acts of care that transcended fear, absence, and time. The reflection shimmered in the candlelight, the lattice of seams stretching and folding to accommodate every gesture, every memory, every small offering. Mara saw faces both familiar and unknown, old and young, real and imagined. Each one existed in that fragile space, held together by the quiet, deliberate acts of those willing to participate. The host's voice, soft and intimate, might offer one final thought. We all leave traces, whether we realize it or not. Sometimes they take the form of objects, sometimes in words, sometimes in the quiet gestures we offer to each other and to memory itself. What do we leave behind, and who or what receives it? And in the stillness of attention do we find not just remembrance, but connection? Mara and Jonah lingered a moment longer, watching the candle flame tremble and settle. The woman with the bag departed silently, leaving only the lattice of memory, the reflection in the pumpkin, and the growing network of care on the stoop. Each object, each gesture, each reflection, however small, had become part of something enduring. The burned house on Mill Street was no longer just a ruin. It was a place of communion, a quiet altar, where human attention and memory intertwined. The pumpkin, flickering with candlelight, reflected not only faces, but acts of care, fragments of past lives, and the living presence of those willing to honor them. Mara understood, finally, that remembrance was not merely an act of looking back. It was a practice, a network of attention stitched together with small, deliberate gestures, witnessed in silence and held by the fragile, enduring lattice of human care. As she walked home that night, the wind carrying the faint scent of lavender and smoke, Mara felt a profound sense of quiet satisfaction. The stoop, the pumpkin, the burned house, they were all more than objects or ruins. They were living witnesses to human attention, repositories of memory, and places where small, deliberate acts could stitch the past and present together. And in the reflection of the candlelight, she knew that every gesture, every ribbon, note, thimble, or photograph had mattered. For a moment, she paused at the corner, looking back at the flickering glow. She whispered into the night, almost as if to the stoop itself, "Thank you for seeing us." The flame danced, the seams shimmered, and the lattice of faces seemed to stretch into the darkness, embracing all who had come before, all who were present, and all who would arrive in the nights to come. The burned house remained silent, the pumpkin flickered, and Mill Street slept under the gentle, watchful presence of human memory. Quiet, unassuming, and yet profoundly alive. The mailbox at 42 Mill Street had been empty for years. Rust crept along its edges and the paint flaked in the October wind. No one in the neighborhood could remember a letter ever being delivered there, not since the house had been abandoned and the family had moved away decades earlier. Yet one damp evening, a letter appeared. Simon found it as he walked home from the corner store, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the orange glow of streetlights painting his shadow long across the sidewalk. He bent down, brushing raindrops from the envelope. It was unmarked, no name, no return address, just an aged paper with slightly curled corners and a thin red ribbon binding it. The ink was faint, but legible. "Do not open until midnight. Do not ignore what is written. You may not understand now, but you will." Simon's fingers trembled. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, and somehow unnervingly familiar. He had walked past the house countless times, and never had he felt the pull of something waiting. But now the quietness of the street, the damp smell of rain, and the isolation of the house conspired to make him curious, uneasy, and compelled all at once. As he pocketed the letter, a whisper of wind stirred the empty lot next door. Simon paused, imagining footsteps, or something else, on the cracked pavement. "Probably just leaves," he muttered to himself, though the sound of his own voice felt fragile in the dark. That night the house was silent, save for the occasional groan of old boards and the distant hum of traffic far enough away to be almost invisible. Simon waited until the clock struck 12. He sat on the edge of his bed, the envelope resting on his knees. A question surfaced, almost audibly. Why me? Why now? He hesitated, heart pounding, then untied the thin red ribbon and unfolded the letter carefully. Inside was a single line of text. "Look for the hand. It will show you the way." Simon frowned. The message was cryptic, but something about the phrasing made his skin prickle. He turned the letter over, half expecting more, but the page was blank. He leaned back, considering the absurdity. Who would leave a letter with such a vague warning? and yet the handwriting, the ribbon, and the exacting words made it feel real, anchored to something just beyond comprehension. The host's voice might pause here, calm and intimate. Have you ever received a message you couldn't ignore, even though it made no sense? A note that seemed to demand action, even if only in the quiet corners of your mind. Simon tried to sleep, but found the letter impossible to put aside. Images flickered through his mind, a hand reaching from darkness, a shadow lingering at the corner of the street, his own fingers brushing the envelope. Each thought left him tense, alert, aware of the silence of his apartment in a way that felt almost wrong. The following day, he returned to Mill Street under a pale morning sky. The house at 42 Mill Street was empty, windows dark and dull, but as Simon approached, he noticed something he had never seen before. A small, pale handprint on the side of the mailbox, pressed into the peeling paint. It was subtle, as if it had been made by someone, or something, careful, deliberate. His stomach turned, and he stepped back instinctively. Was this always here? He whispered aloud, but no answer came. Only the wind, rustling leaves, and the faint scent of rain. Simon returned home, but the image of the handprint haunted him. That night, he examined the mailbox through the window. The handprint seemed to shift under the glow of the streetlight, the fingers elongating and curling slightly in a way that defied physics. He rubbed his eyes, certain it was a trick of shadow and light. But when he looked again, the handprint was as distinct as before, impossibly pale against the rust and peeling paint. The host's voice might interject here. Sometimes we see things that shouldn't exist, and yet they do. How often do we trust our own eyes, even when reality seems to wobble at the edges? Simon's curiosity began to overtake fear. The following night, he brought a small flashlight and a camera, hoping to document what he had seen. He approached the mailbox cautiously. The handprint was there, unchanged, though the faint shimmer of streetlight made it seem almost like a reflection in water. He raised his camera and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated more than he expected. Behind the mailbox, partially hidden in the shadows, he saw a figure crouched low, its features obscured by darkness. Simon froze, heart hammering. The figure did not move, only remained there, small and tense, like it had been waiting for him. He lowered the camera slowly, expecting it to vanish, but it did not. The figure's outline suggested a child's height, perhaps younger, but its posture was unnatural, rigid and still. Simon took a hesitant step back. The figure moved, or perhaps it had always been moving, sliding closer without sound. His instincts screamed at him to run, but some part of him, the same part that had opened the letter, wanted to understand. The handprint, the letter, the figure, they were connected, though how and why remained unclear. Days passed, and the phenomena intensified. Simon received more letters, each left at the doorstep of his apartment in the same faint, precise handwriting. They were brief, cryptic instructions. Follow the path of shadows. Do not touch the hand until you are ready. Listen for the silence between breaths. The letters were unsigned, but Simon noticed subtle patterns, the same style of looping ink, the faint red smudge on the corner of each envelope, and the careful folding that suggested meticulous preparation. The letters arrived without fail, sometimes sliding under his door, sometimes appearing in his mailbox when he had checked only moments before. One evening, unable to resist, Simon decided to act. He walked back to 42 Mill Street, flashlight in hand, camera in pocket, and a sense of purpose he could barely define. The mailbox was as he remembered, the handprint visible and eerie. He approached carefully, wondering if he was stepping into something beyond reason. He reached out, hesitating just above the surface of the paint. The moment his fingers brushed the handprint, the world seemed to shift. The air grew heavier and the shadows deepened around him. For a fleeting second, Simon thought he saw the fingers of the handprint twitch, flex, and then elongate toward him as if trying to pull him in. He recoiled, stumbling backward, heart hammering, eyes wide. Then silence. He looked around. The street was empty. The wind had died. Only the faint flicker of streetlights illuminated the wet pavement. Yet the feeling remained that someone was observing him, waiting for his next move. The host's voice might ask here, softly and knowingly. Have you ever felt the weight of an unseen presence, the way it presses on your senses, not with violence, but with expectation? How do you respond when curiosity and fear collide? Simon returned home that night, exhausted but compelled. The letters had begun to feel less like instructions and more like invitations, coaxing him deeper into a mystery he did not fully understand. Each line, each red smear of ink, carried a weight he could not ignore. The letter, the handprint, the shadowed figure, they were pieces of a puzzle that demanded his attention, promising a revelation he was both eager and afraid to witness. Over the next few nights, Simon experimented. He left small offerings at the base of the mailbox, coins, scraps of paper, a ribbon he found in his drawer. Each time he did, the handprint seemed to respond. Shadows shifted subtly, elongating or recoiling, depending on what he left behind. It was as if the mailbox itself had become a conduit, a point where memory, attention, and something else, something not entirely human, intersected. Jonah, Mara's older cousin, and a casual skeptic, had been observing Simon's obsession from a distance. One evening, he appeared leaning against the curb with arms crossed. "You're taking this too far," he said, voice low. "It's a mailbox and some kid's prank, or maybe it's the wind. Go home before you get hurt." Simon hesitated. I think it's something else," he said. "I can't explain it, but it's like the hand. It wants something. Or maybe it knows something. I have to find out." Jonah shook his head, but stayed nearby, curious despite himself. Together they approached the mailbox, Simon carefully reaching toward the handprint again. The fingers, still pale, still impossible, seemed to twitch in anticipation. And then, as he touched it, a shiver ran through his body. He felt a pressure, subtle but insistent, like a gentle tug not toward the paint, but into something else entirely. The host's voice might ask here, intimate and quiet. Have you ever felt a tug you could not resist, even knowing it might be dangerous? What would you do if an unseen hand beckoned, insisting you follow it into the unknown? Simon did not pull away immediately. He lingered, breathing shallow, senses alert to every flicker of light, every movement in the shadows. Jonah watched, tense and skeptical, but unable to look away. The world seemed to hold its breath as Simon waited for some sign, some answer from the hand, the mailbox, or the darkness surrounding them. A soft rustling came from inside the mailbox, as if the letters themselves were shifting. Simon leaned closer, heart racing, and for a moment thought he saw a faint glow emanating from within, a pale, spectral light that made the handprint seem almost three-dimensional. He stepped back instinctively, but not before the glow flared briefly, illuminating something pressed behind the handprint, a small, skeletal hand, curled delicately as though in sleep. Simon froze. Jonah whispered, "What is it?" Simon could not answer. The skeletal hand, impossibly delicate and unnerving, remained visible only for a heartbeat before retreating into shadow. The street returned to its previous stillness, but the memory of the light, the The movement, the impossible hand, lingered in Simon's mind with an almost physical weight. The night after Simon saw the skeletal hand, sleep felt impossible. His apartment, usually a haven of quiet and order, seemed suddenly unfamiliar, the shadows too deep, the air too thick. He kept turning the letters over in his mind, their delicate folds, the faint red smudge of ink, the deliberate looping handwriting, and the memory of the handprint pressed at the edge of his consciousness, like a pulse he could not ignore. By morning he was exhausted, but a compulsion pulled him back to 42 Mill Street. The mailbox, unchanged yet somehow more commanding than before, waited patiently in the dim streetlight. Simon approached slowly, aware of the small footsteps he made on wet pavement. He reached out, touching the handprint again. The surface was cold, but beneath it he felt the faintest vibration, like the heartbeat of the street itself. He recoiled slightly, but not completely. It was then that the first letter arrived. It slid silently under his door, its edges wet from the rain outside. Simon unfolded it with trembling fingers. "Do not ignore the whispers. Listen for the gaps in the sound. They speak more than words. The hand waits, but you must follow the rhythm." He reread it several times, each pass deepening a sense of unease. The words were simple, yet precise, carrying an authority he could not rationalize. Simon thought of the skeletal hand, curled delicately in the mailbox, how it had appeared, then vanished, and he felt a strange pressure in his chest, a subtle insistence that he continue. The host's voice might ask here, "Have you ever been drawn to something you cannot explain, something that seems to pulse with intention? How do you decide whether to obey curiosity or flee from it?" Simon decided to obey. He returned to Mill Street that evening with a flashlight, a notebook, and the letters he had collected. He crouched by the mailbox, touching the handprint lightly with a finger. The pale residue of paint or ink seemed to cling to him, almost alive, and the wind stirred faintly, carrying whispers he could not immediately place. "Do you hear that?" he whispered to himself. The sound was subtle, more a suggestion than a noise, a soft, uneven rustling, almost like voices shifting in a conversation too quiet to catch. Simon pressed his ear closer. The wind rustled the wet leaves along the sidewalk, but the whispers seemed to have structure, a rhythm that aligned with the letter's instructions. Listen for the gaps in the sound. He pulled out his notebook, scribbling observations as quickly as his hand could move. Each word, each line, attempted to capture the strange cadence, the fleeting bursts of sound that rose and fell like breaths in the night. The skeletal hand, or the memory of it, seemed to hover in his mind, urging him onward. Jonah appeared then, silently, watching Simon from the edge of the street. "I told you this was dangerous," he muttered, though there was curiosity in his tone as well. "But I want to see it." Simon handed him one of the letters. Jonah examined it, frowning. "You think someone's doing this deliberately?" "I don't know," Simon admitted. "But I think it's more than that. The hand, it's not just a hand. It's like it's guiding us." They returned night after night, documenting the whispers, touching the handprint, leaving small objects, coins, a piece of string, a button from Simon's backpack at the base of the mailbox. Each act seemed to influence the faint vibrations in the air, the subtle rhythm of the whispers, the way the shadows stretched along the cracked pavement. Other neighbours began noticing. Mrs. Dunley, the elderly woman across the street, mentioned a strange light flickering near the mailbox when she walked her dog late at night. A pair of teenagers on bicycles slowed their pace, curious about the small glow that seemed to pulse with each visit. None dared approach directly, but the presence of others, even in the periphery, lent the nights an uncanny sense of communal attention. One evening, Simon received a new letter. The hand is patient. It will not speak until it knows your intent. Show your willingness, leave a fragment of your own life. Simon understood the instruction immediately. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small key, a key to a locker he had not used in years, containing photographs, letters, and other personal mementos. He laid it at the base of the mailbox with deliberate care. The wind whispered through the leaves as though acknowledging the gesture. For the first time, the handprint seemed to shimmer faintly, the pale fingers stretching in a subtle, almost imperceptible curl. Jonah observed quietly. "Do you think it understands what we leave?" Simon nodded, though uncertainty lingered. "I don't think it's human," he admitted softly. "But it reacts to human attention. That's why we matter." The nights grew longer and colder, the October air carrying the damp scent of fallen leaves and distant smoke. The letters arrived with increasing frequency, each one guiding Simon and Jonah deeper into the rhythm of the hand, deeper into a pattern that was at once subtle and insistent. They began to notice small details, shadows that lingered longer than they should, the shimmer of paint along the handprint, the faint, sweet smell of wax or resin that accompanied the whispers. One night, as they crouched beside the mailbox, Simon noticed something new. A small piece of parchment, yellowed and folded, tucked just behind the handprint. He reached carefully, pulling it free. The writing was faint, almost imperceptible. "The hand does not take, it offers. What you leave will return, transformed. Trust its patience, and you will see." The message gave Simon pause. He realized that the mailbox, the handprint, and the letters were not merely tests of courage, they were a dialogue, a slow and deliberate conversation between human attention and something beyond. The host might ask here, have you ever encountered something that seemed alive, yet silent? Something that demanded not fear, but attention and respect? How would you participate in a conversation with what you cannot see? The following nights blurred together. Simon and Jonah left small objects each evening, observed the handprint, listened to the whispers, and catalogued the letters. Each act deepened their connection to the phenomena. Shadows seemed to fold around them, guiding their movements, aligning with the instructions in the letters. It was as if the street itself, the mailbox and the handprint, had become a single entity, responsive to deliberate, patient attention. One evening, Simon noticed movement in the alley behind the house. A small figure crouched low, partially obscured by shadow. Its presence was faint, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. It mirrored their actions, observing but not interfering, as though it were a witness, an audience, or a participant in its own quiet way. The skeletal hand, once only visible in fleeting flashes, began to appear more distinctly in Simon's mind. He imagined its fingers stretching toward the objects they left, curling delicately around coins, keys, and scraps of paper. Each act of leaving became part of a conversation, each fragment a word in a language he did not yet understand. Jonah spoke quietly one night, almost in awe. "It's like it's teaching us something," Simon nodded. "Maybe it is, or maybe it's reminding us how to pay attention, how to leave something behind that matters." As the section closes, Simon understood that the handprint, the letters, and the skeletal presence in the mailbox were not threats, but invitations. Invitations to witness, to participate, and to honor a delicate rhythm of attention and memory. The night was still, the street empty, and yet the unseen hand seemed alive, waiting patiently for the next act, the next gesture, the next moment of deliberate human presence. By the time the last week of October arrived, Simon and Jonah had fallen into a rhythm with the mailbox and its whispering handprint. Each night they arrived together, leaving small offerings, a thimble, a coin, a ribbon, a photograph. They meticulously documented the sequence of letters and the subtle reactions of the handprint, which seemed to pulse faintly in response to their attention. The letters had become more cryptic, more demanding of observation and patience. One night, Simon unfolded the latest envelope to find only a single line. "Step inside if you dare, but take nothing that does not belong to you. The hand will guide." Simon paused, staring at the faint red smudge on the paper. He glanced at Jonah, whose eyes reflected the same mixture of curiosity and apprehension that Simon felt. They had never ventured into the abandoned house itself. Until now, all interactions had been with the mailbox and the handprint. The idea of stepping across the threshold where decades of abandonment and memory waited sent a shiver down their spines. The host's voice might ask here, "Have you ever felt an invitation you could not refuse, knowing it might be dangerous, or that it might change you? How do you decide when to step into the unknown?" They approached the house carefully. Its charred siding, cracked windows, and sagging roof gave the impression of complete abandonment. Yet the presence Simon felt from the mailbox seemed to extend into the building itself. Every step across the threshold was deliberate, cautious, measured, as though the air inside were alive, aware of their movement. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood, dust, and something faintly sweet, an undercurrent of resin, candle wax, and perhaps something else, undefinable yet oddly comforting. The floorboards groaned under their weight, and the shadows seemed to shift subtly, as if aware of their presence. Simon carried the letters, Jonah followed with a flashlight, and together they navigated the dim interior. In the corner of the main room, a faint glow drew their attention. Simon approached and saw the hand again, skeletal and delicate, reaching from a crack in the wall, as though extending a welcome, or a test. Its fingers moved slowly, curling toward a small piece of ribbon that had floated down from the ceiling beams. Simon held his breath, noting how the hand's movement mirrored the rhythm and intent of their previous actions at the mailbox. Jonah whispered, "It's alive." "I think it's more than that," Simon said. "It's aware. It responds to intention, not just action." As they explored, they discovered faint traces of previous interactions. Scratches in the wood that matched the patterns of the handprint, small objects left tucked into cracks in the wall, remnants of paper or fabric that had likely been offerings decades ago. The house itself seemed to exist as an extension of the hand, a repository of attention and memory stretching beyond the mailbox. One room contained a stack of letters yellowed and brittle with age, hidden under a loose floorboard. Simon carefully unfolded one. The handwriting matched the letters they had been receiving, though the ink had faded. The message was clear. Those who pay attention may pass, but only when the hand deems them worthy. Leave what matters and witness what cannot be spoken. The host might pause here. Sometimes the places we fear the most are the ones that ask only for observation and care. What would you leave behind if you were asked to participate in a quiet ritual beyond the ordinary? Simon and Jonah realized that the skeletal hand had been guiding visitors for decades, perhaps longer. The mailbox had been its conduit to the outside world, and the house its sanctum, preserving not objects alone, but the deliberate attention of those who had interacted with it. Each offering, each act of care, was absorbed and remembered by the hand and by the house itself, creating a network of memory that stretched beyond a single night, a single person. The house whispered with a presence that was not threatening but persistent, insisting on patience, observation, and intentionality. Simon left a photograph from his childhood, carefully placed on a mantel, coated in dust. Jonah tucked a coin into a crack in the floorboards. Each gesture caused a subtle reaction, a twitch of the hand, a faint pulse of light in the shadows, a rustle of paper that felt almost like acknowledgement. A sudden movement in the corner made Simon tense. The skeletal hand had withdrawn slightly, then extended again, beckoning toward the staircase that led to the second floor. They exchanged a glance. "Do we—" Jonah began. Simon nodded, feeling a mix of fear and trust. They ascended carefully, flashlight illuminating the decayed floorboards. On the second floor, the air was colder, heavier. Shadows clung to the corners, and faint whispers seemed to weave in the silence, urging observation. Small remnants of objects were tucked along windowsills, bits of ribbon, scraps of paper, tiny trinkets. Each object seemed deliberately placed, almost ceremonial. The hand had guided countless visitors here before them, leaving traces of memory embedded in the house itself. Simon noticed a small alcove at the end of the hall. Inside was a single, ornate box, its surface carved with intricate patterns of hands and fingers. He hesitated, recalling the letter's warnings. "Take nothing that does not belong to you." With care, he touched the lid, feeling the faint warmth beneath his fingertips, as though the house itself were alive, responsive. The host might ask here, "Have you ever hesitated before touching something you knew could change your understanding of the world? How do we weigh curiosity against caution?" Jonah watched, tense, and then gently placed a coin beside the box. The hand, appearing from the shadows, curled slowly, acknowledging the gesture. A subtle vibration ran through the floorboards and a faint glow emanated from within the box. Simon leaned closer. Inside, he saw objects they had left at the mailbox: ribbon, coins, scraps of paper, all transformed, delicate and pristine, as though preserved in time. "This is incredible," Jonah whispered. "It's keeping everything. It's honoring it." Simon realized the truth. The hand, the house, and the letters were part of a ritual spanning decades. They preserved not just objects, but attention, care, and the quiet acts of those willing to participate. Every gesture mattered. Every offering was remembered. The skeletal hand moved again, this time higher, toward the ceiling, and Simon felt an irresistible pull, not toward the hand, but toward the act of giving, observing, participating. The letters had been guiding them here. Yes, but the house demanded presence, attentiveness, and respect. Simon understood finally that the house and the hand were not threatening, but patient. They did not force action, nor demand submission. They simply waited for those willing to participate, to leave fragments of life and to witness the quiet, persistent memory of attention preserved across time. The host might close this reflection. Sometimes what seems like fear is only an invitation to pay attention, to leave something behind, and to witness what cannot be spoken aloud. What would you leave and what would you hope to see in return? As Simon and Jonah descended the stairs, their understanding deepened. The house was alive with memory, and the skeletal hand was its gentle, persistent guardian. Every step, every gesture, every quiet observation mattered. The mailbox, the letters, and the hand were simply the outward expression of something far older and far more deliberate. A quiet, enduring dialogue between human care and something beyond comprehension. The street outside was still, the October night calm, and the handprint on the mailbox seemed to pulse faintly, anticipating the next act, the next gesture, the next moment of deliberate attention. Simon felt a profound sense of connection, a mix of awe, curiosity, and reverence. They had entered the house not to conquer it, but to witness it, to participate in its rhythm, and in doing so had become part of the network of memory that stretched across time. The section ends here, with Simon and Jonah understanding the scale and patience of the hand, the letters and the house, ready for the final, revealing Section 4, where the culmination of their encounters and the quiet horror of Mill Street becomes fully tangible. The nights after Simon and Jonah explored the house were quieter, yet heavier with anticipation. The letters had ceased arriving, but the handprint on the mailbox pulsed faintly under streetlight, as if awaiting the next gesture. It was as though the house and the hand had absorbed enough attention to pause, observing their next actions, evaluating their willingness to participate further. Simon walked past the house each evening, flashlight in pocket, notebook tucked under his arm, and a careful sense of rhythm in his steps. The air smelled faintly of wet wood and resin, the scent of attention lingering where it had been cultivated. Jonah followed sometimes, sometimes not, trusting Simon's intuition, yet uneasy about the strange communion that had formed between human presence and an impossible skeletal hand. One night, Simon approached the mailbox and noticed the handprint shifting subtly, the fingers curling and uncurling with an almost deliberate patience. He knelt to leave a small bundle, a photograph of his childhood home, a ribbon from his backpack, and a coin he had carried for years as a talisman of sorts. Each object felt heavy with intention, charged with the care he had brought to the act. The skeletal hand emerged fully this time, small and delicate, stretching from the shadowed corner of the mailbox. It hovered above the objects, fingers trembling slightly in acknowledgement, but not touching. The air seemed to hold its breath. Simon felt the pull again, not physical, but emotional, as if the hand's presence demanded more than observation. It demanded intention, patience, and attention. A whisper of wind carried a faint sound like paper brushing against wood, or perhaps the rustle of a garment long left in a drawer. Simon held his breath, sensing the rhythm of the hand, the pulse of memory, and the fragile network of attention that connected him, Jonah, the previous visitors, and the house itself. The host might ask here, have you ever been part of something older than yourself, something patient enough to wait across decades, and yet responsive to the smallest gestures? How does it feel to be seen, even by something you cannot fully comprehend? Jonah crouched beside him, leaving a small, worn key he had found in his pocket, a key to a locker he hadn't used in years. Together they watched the hand hover above the offerings, sensing the connection deepen, the unseen lattice of memory folding around them. The hand's fingers flexed in recognition, and for a fleeting moment, Simon imagined it had smiled. Not a human smile, not one that could speak, but a gesture of acknowledgement, subtle and profound. Days passed. The air grew colder, the October wind carrying fallen leaves across the empty street. Simon and Jonah continued their vigil, observing the handprint, leaving small objects, and documenting the experience. Occasionally, they saw movement in the shadowed corners of the house, fleeting, almost imperceptible, but never threatening. The skeletal hand, the mailbox, the letters, and the house were not malevolent. They were patient, deliberate, and enduring. One night, Simon noticed a faint glow emanating from the mailbox. He approached cautiously, kneeling to observe. The skeletal hand had withdrawn slightly, then returned, curling over the objects he had left. The glow intensified, illuminating the offerings, the ribbon, the photograph, the coin, the key. Each item seemed transformed, pristine and delicate, almost as if the hand had preserved them in time, honoring the attention Simon had brought. The host might interject softly. Sometimes the quietest acts of care are the ones most remembered. What we leave behind, no matter how small, may resonate far longer than we imagine. How often do we pause to consider the weight of our attention? Simon felt a profound connection that night, not just to the hand or the house, but to all who had come before, all who had left something of themselves. He realized that the mailbox and skeletal hand were a repository not only of objects, but of deliberate human attention, fragments of lives, gestures of care, moments preserved in quiet observation. Jonah whispered, "It's not scary, it's honoring us." Simon nodded. "It's patience, it waits. It shows us the value of noticing, of giving, of participating without expectation." Weeks passed, and the neighborhood became aware of a subtle change. Neighbors, noticing faint lights, shadows, or the gentle ritual at 42 Mill Street, approached cautiously. Some left small offerings of their own, a ribbon, a trinket, a photograph. The street, once empty and silent, had become a place of quiet communion. The hand, skeletal and patient, responded in kind, weaving new threads into the lattice of memory it preserved. The letters ceased entirely. The mailbox, the handprint, and the house maintained a subtle rhythm of attention, waiting for those willing to participate. Simon and Jonah no longer felt compelled to act every night. They had learned the language, the rhythm, the quiet practice of giving and observing. The skeletal hand had taught them the value of deliberate attention, the endurance of memory, and the quiet power of human care. The host's reflective voice might close here. Sometimes the things we fear are only guardians of memory. They wait for us to notice, to honor, to participate. What would you leave behind if asked? How would you choose to be remembered, even in the smallest gesture? Simon walked home one night, feeling the cool October wind on his face. He glanced back at 42 Mill Street. The skeletal hand remained in its vigil, curling slightly over the mailbox, serene and patient. The street was quiet, the house asleep, yet the presence of attention lingered in the air, tangible and enduring. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "Thank you for waiting." The mailbox, the handprint, the skeletal fingers, they held their vigil still, guarding the quiet rhythm of human attention, honoring each gesture and preserving memory across time. On Mill Street, under the watchful eye of the patient hand, nothing was lost. Every act of care, every small offering, and every attentive glance was remembered, folded into a lattice of memory that reached beyond fear, beyond explanation, and into the enduring quiet of presence. The night remained calm. The October wind carried the faint scent of wet wood and resin. The house at 42 Mill Street, the skeletal hand, and the mailbox waited patiently, inviting those willing to notice, to participate, and to leave behind fragments of themselves. And in that waiting, the quiet horror of the street became something gentle, profound and human, an enduring testament to attention, memory, and the small acts that ripple across time. Tonight, we wandered through abandoned streets, whispered with shadows, and witnessed the quiet persistence of attention in the most unexpected places. From promises made on haunted porches, to pumpkins reflecting more than our own faces, to a skeletal hand patiently waiting on Mill Street, each story reminds us the smallest gestures, the quietest acts, and the moments we choose to notice. They all matter. Take a breath. Notice the corners of your room, the soft sounds around you, the spaces between the beats of your own heartbeat. What would you leave behind if something unseen asked for a fragment of your life? What would you remember, and what would you hope to see returned in quiet acknowledgement? If tonight's stories held you just long enough to make you pause, to shiver softly, or to reflect on what lingers in silence, consider subscribing. That way, new, calm, history-infused horror will find you most nights. Drop your city and local time in the comments and tell me which detail stayed with you: the whispered promise, the reflection in the pumpkin, the patient hand. Let's map this quiet night, together across the world. And remember, the streets are silent, the mailboxes are waiting, the pumpkins still glimmer in the shadows, and even the smallest acts of attention have their own enduring power. Good night, and may the quiet watchfulness of these stories stay with you gently as you drift towards sleep.